The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus heard of the death of John the Baptist, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. The crowds heard of this and followed him on foot from their towns. When he disembarked, he saw a vast crowd. His heart was moved with pity for them, and he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples approached him and said, "There is a deserted place, and it is already late. Dismiss the crowds so that they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "There is no need for them to go away. Give them some food yourselves." But they said to him, "5 loaves and 2 fish are all we have here." Then he said, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he said the blessing, broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples, who in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up the fragments left over, 12 wicker baskets full. Those who ate were about 5,000 men, not counting women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord.
It was a couple weeks ago. I had a day probably that many of you have. It was extremely, extremely busy. How many of you have ever had a day that you're just running and running and running? Every day we're probably running and running and running. I had a day like that a couple weeks ago. As I sometimes do, I both the 7 and 8 o'clock masses in the morning, and immediately after the 8 o'clock mass, I had to leave to go to do a burial of cremains from a funeral that took place a couple weeks earlier. And as I was running to the car after the 8 o'clock mass, getting into the car, I realized that, there was no time to eat breakfast. So there's an easy solution to that. My good close friend Tim Hortons can handle that problem, and went through the drive-thru and got my bagel and my coffee and had breakfast in the car. I won't ask for a show of hands how many of you have ever had a meal in the car. I think most of us have. And immediately after that burial, I had to go to the chancery for some meetings, and it was about 2 in the afternoon. I was driving home here to St. Greg's, and I knew I had a 3 o'clock appointment, and it dawned on me that I hadn't had anything to eat for lunch. 2 Big Macs for $4. It was on the marquee. It was the deal, and so I pulled in and did the drive-through and brought it back to the rectory, where I vacuumed it up quickly. I won't ask for a show of hands how many times you've done something like that in your own home. And then I went on with the rest of the afternoon, early evening, and then when it came to be evening, I had a great opportunity to go to my favorite restaurant with friends and have my favorite dinner. I enjoyed my beef Wellington. Every forkful I savored. It tasted excellent. And what was better than the meal itself were the people I was with. We were there for 2-3 hours just enjoying a nice, relaxing time of friendship and a very good meal. Who's hungry now, huh? I'm going to guess if I ask for a show of hands, you've all had a meal like that too. where you just savored every last forkful because the food was so very good, and the company was even better. Now, if I would ask for a show of hands, and I'll give you a break this Sunday, I won't ask for a show of hands, but if I'm going to ask for a show of hands, which one of the three meals you would prefer to have, the drive-through, in the car, probably nobody raised their hands as a preference, right? The 2 Big Macs for $4 to vacuum quickly at home, probably none of you would raise your hands, but how many of you for the nice meal that you savor? We'd all raise our hands for that one, right? Our readings today talk a lot about food. First reading, Prophet Isaiah talks about, if you're thirsty, come to get something to drink. If you're hungry, come receive the grain and eat. Don't waste your money on things that won't sustain you, but on what will be provided for your life. And in the gospel, we hear the very familiar story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Question this Sunday: we all know what it is to grab a meal real quick as we're doing something else because we gotta eat something. We all know what it's like to vacuum up something real fast to satisfy our stomach. If we all know what it's like to truly savor and enjoy a fine meal with good friends. If you take the differences, apply it now to your life of prayer and our understanding of the Eucharist. As we gather and we celebrate the Eucharist each and every Sunday, we're the ones who are here every Sunday. So as we come every Sunday, as we maybe approach our Lord in prayer every day, is it a quick trip through the drive-through because we just got to get this done and move on with the rest of the day? Is it something we try to vacuum up real quick? You're important, Lord, but I really just don't have the time. Or is our personal daily prayer and our experience of coming to Mass each and every Sunday a fine meal, a fine time to be truly savored and enjoyed without worry of time and what might be coming down the road next? As we look at this, we need to simply question how it is we treat our prayer, how we approach the Lord in prayer, and allow the Lord to share that time with us. A number of years ago, at least 25 years ago, when I was in the seminary, I was assigned to Niagara Falls one summer, Our Lady of Mount Carmel Parish, and I met a wonderful woman, Josephine Panatoni. She was stricken down in death in the prime of her life at the age of 95. And she came to Mass daily when I first arrived. She lived only 3 doors down, but it would take her about 20 minutes to walk there because her heart was so bad. Literally every step she'd have to stop and catch her breath. And eventually she couldn't do that any longer, and we started going every day to take communion to her because that was so important to her. And I remember one visit as we sat in the living room when I took communion to her, she talked about her life, and she said, when I was a little girl, some of you will remember these days, she said, when I was a little girl, I went to Catholic school. We began every day at Mass. And she said, I went on to high school. I went to Mass every day still. She said, I started to work, and she said, I go to Mass on my way to work, and churches were open in those days. So on the way home from work, I could stop and pray. She said, then I got married. I believe she had 6 children, if I remember correctly. She said, I was raising 6 children. Eventually, my parents became elderly and ill. They needed assistance, so they moved in with us. At the same time, my in-laws became elderly and needed assistance, and they moved in with us. She said, I was lucky every day to at least take a couple minutes to close the door to my room and sit alone and at least offer a Hail Mary and an Our Father. She said, now I'm old, and she prayed her prayer book. It was disintegrating, kind of prayer book you want to have, well used. Her rosary had welts in them from being pounded. She told me she prayed the rosary 15 times a day. She had cards in her prayer book of everyone she promised to pray for, the names and the intentions. And she said, as I am approaching the end of my life, the only thing I'm concerned about, and I hope God forgives me, is that I watch wrestling on pay-per-view. I assured her God would probably cut her a break, and overlook that. And as I reflected on that conversation with dear Josephine, she really taught me a valuable lesson about having a covenant of prayer with God, that given our state in life, in some moments of our period of life, we may have a little bit more time to spend in prayer, and at different moments in the state of our life, we may have less time. But regardless of our state in life, throughout our whole life, to be able to have that quality time, even if it's just a few moments, to close our door, not as a fast food drive-through, but to savor the most that we can in our relationship, our covenant of prayer with the Lord. Today we think about that, how we approach our daily prayer, we approach the celebration of the Eucharist. What sometimes keeps us from really enjoying each other's company? We all have our quirks. One of the quirks that I have a lot of quirks. You're probably figuring that out by now. But, there's a couple people from Our Lady of Pompeii at Mass right now. They could tell you about all my quirks. But one of the quirks I have, maybe you have the same, is when you're having a meal together, I do not like when we have our cell phones on the table and people check their texts and voicemail messages. Sometimes maybe out of necessity it has to happen, especially if we're caring for somebody who's ill or elderly. But it becomes a distraction. And all of us have distractions in our life. It's part of human life. And St. Paul in the second reading is talking about distractions, and he raises a beautiful question. He said, what can possibly separate us from the love of God? So what distraction can be great enough to separate us from the love of God? And he begins by saying suffering. That suffering, physical suffering, human suffering, that is not going to separate us from the love of God. And then he goes on, he said, well, human existence, death and life, that won't separate us from the love of God. And he goes on to say, well, spirits maybe, angels, principalities, powers. No, those things won't separate us from the love of God either. And he goes on, he said, well, time, present concerns, future concerns. No, that won't separate us from the love of God either. And he goes on to say, well, maybe astronomical forces, height and depth. No, that won't separate us from the love of God. And St. Paul in all of his writings eventually reveals to us there's only one thing that can separate us from the love of God, only one distraction that can separate us from the love of God, and that is our free will. If we freely choose to separate ourselves from that love of God, if we choose to reject that love. And sometimes that comes without us even thinking, especially if prayer becomes like a fast food drive-through and we eventually become disconnected from the Lord. Sometimes we start to believe that our personal will is more important than God's will. Sometimes we start to believe that the values of society outrank the values, the will of God. So today as we reflect on these readings, we simply think, where are we with placing God's will above our own and those choices presented to us in larger society? And we take all of that to our experience of prayer. As our prayer, as our celebration of the Eucharist, a fast food drive-through, or really time to genuinely be savored.